Check, 1, 2, 3. Check, 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 check. How are you, Dana?
Yep.
Where do you want me? Where do you want me? Just up here? Okay.
Just gonna hold out and see if Gary shows up.
Now there's a second PowerPoint on here that I would probably put in after this one. Do you want to move that now to the other device, or? And then will you be able to flip-flop them when I get to that point?
Which one?
The meth trends one. Here you go.
We're starting with this.
Yes.
And I will. Bear hunting. Bear hunting. Is Gary? No, unless you want to watch that or check this. You got the clickers, so just let me know when you want that changed.
Okay. How you doing, Jesse?
Welcome back. It feels like it. I can't even imagine. You better make the most today. It's okay, you're not.
How's it going? Are you gonna talk? Are you gonna talk at all?
She just asked me. I mean, I can make some introductory remarks. I got a list I want to show you. Probably today. You know, we've been keeping track of the 11 o'clocks since June 30th. We've got 32 names
Okay.
on there, and I think the heartening thing is since the judges adopted the guidelines.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Everybody, I think, with the exception of one, has been ordered to CTC. So.
We got a packed morning. I want to thank you all for coming on a Friday morning to this. I'm Tiana Glenn. I'm the Criminal Justice Coordinator for Eau Claire. embarked on this adventure with the two presentations that are scheduled today. First, starting with the Department of Corrections and the compass that we're using throughout the state right now. And we wanted to make sure, we were going to, the second half of this, we're going to be talking about the compass, what it is, how to interpret it, and how the counties are using it. Jared Hoyt from Department of Corrections will be here. This morning, we have a committee in Eau Claire County that is working with our methamphetamine issues that we're seeing within the county, our meth response committee. And so we have Andy here that's going to be talking to us about methamphetamine, and I'll let him do his introduction. But I also am going to ask Gary King, our district attorney, to speak about what our MRC committee is as we get involved in this and some of the work that we're doing in our county. We'd like to be able to share with the other counties that are in this room and make you all aware of what we are actually doing in the county in response to the methamphetamine that we're seeing through our cases that are coming through the county. So if you could pay attention to Gary for just a little bit, Gary. Time limit, like a minute.
Thank you all for coming. I think as everyone is aware, methamphetamine has really been on the rise in our community in the last several years, and earlier this year we formed a committee to address that very issue. We've met 7 times since early March. We're meeting again next Monday, and we'll be meeting on a monthly basis going forward, and sort of have developed a 3-tiered approach to try to address the issues that we're seeing with this drug. One is a community outreach committee to educate the public about what is going on and develop some campaigns to make sure that people understand the depth of the problem. Second is a court response subcommittee that has established some bond guidelines and is working with different things that we can do with people involved with cases involving methamphetamine. And the third part is post-disposition, what the Department of Corrections is doing with folks who are on supervision who are involved with this drug. We've had some nice substantive things take place since this committee formed. The outreach committee has had several appearances either on radio, television, and print media. The public's becoming more aware of what's going on with this drug. The bond guidelines that were established in late June were adopted by our judiciary on July 29th. We're tracking methamphetamine cases every day at 11 a.m. court, initial appearance court. We have 32 names on that list as of yesterday. The nice part about that tracking is we've seen our judges routinely now send people to the Community Transition Center for testing since the guidelines were adopted in late July. There are 32 names on that list. And I think it's important for this group because at least in at least 2 of those cases, we noticed that people have charges pending in an adjacent county. So, you know, obviously this drug is something that is not unique just to Eau Claire County. So anyone who wants more information about that group or wants to come to any of the meetings, you're certainly welcome to do it, but really appreciate everyone showing up today to learn more about what's going on with this drug. Thank you. Andy.
Thank you, sir. All right. Well, I'm fairly informal in how I do these presentations. I've got a wonderful PowerPoint here to use as kind of a guideline, but more than anything, I just sort of talk off the top of my head. And so it might meander back and forth at times or whatever, so be patient with me if you would. This is a nice opportunity to talk with this group of people. I see we've got folks from all different walks of the criminal justice community and beyond that, social services and DOC, and it's not often that law enforcement gets a chance to address, you know, a crowd like this and to try and help share this information. It's a very important topic to us. This mic is hot too. It's getting feedback, I think. But methamphetamine is an extreme problem in our area, in our opinion, from law enforcement side. Obviously, the Bar Association is taking it very seriously as well with the formation of this meth response committee. That's been a nice group to bring people that are stakeholders in the criminal justice system and beyond together to examine the problem and try and think of different ways to address it. It is unique. It's a unique drug. It's not like any of the other drugs that we deal with, and I think that we need to address it in a unique manner. if we're going to affect it at all. We can't deal with meth users and meth dealers the same as we deal with marijuana or even cocaine users and dealers, because they are extremely different from one another. A little bit about myself. I know many of the people in the room I've dealt with in one capacity or another. My name's Andy Falk. I'm a detective sergeant with the Eau Claire Police Department. Been in law enforcement for about 22 years. Been associated with the Drug Task Force for about 14 years, and I've been supervising that group for the last 2 years. I took over for Jeff Wilson. So with that, I'll start moving on into this stuff. Couple PowerPoints just to give a little background on methamphetamine, what it is, what it does, how it acts on people. So that should hopefully help you folks. Hopefully a lot of you have not come into contact with methamphetamine or meth users, or you don't have a family member or somebody that's close to you personally that you have this personal knowledge of methamphetamine or what it does. Maybe some of you do. Maybe some of you have had more exposure to it throughout your professional lives than others. But for those of you who don't have a lot of exposure to it, the idea here is to just sort of give you an idea of what the drug is and some of what it does. This is just kind of a canned presentation that the PD has, so I'm not going to follow too closely, but just some strategies for methamphetamine, ways that we can deal with it. You can kind of see that. But this is what methamphetamine is, just some pictures of it for those of you who maybe haven't seen it. Methamphetamine historically, just a little background on it, it kind of came to our area. It became a problem back in the early 2000s, I would say 2003, 2004. Methamphetamine really started to show up in our area. What it is a central nervous system stimulant, very much like cocaine or like crack cocaine, Ritalin, Adderall. Those are all stimulants. Caffeine, nicotine are all stimulants. That's what methamphetamine is as well. Back in the day when it first showed up, it was commonly made. You'd hear about meth labs and these barnyard labs and sheds and things like that where people were making them. And some of this will get into methamphetamine that was made that way. That's not really what we see anymore. Methamphetamine has evolved. Back in the early 2000s when we first started dealing with it, we dealt with a lot of labs. As a matter of fact, the Department of Justice, or DCI, the Division of Criminal Investigation with the Department of Justice for the state, that's pretty much all they did was went from lab to lab to lab cleaning these things up. And the price tag on it was tens of thousands of dollars per incident, and it was funded by the DEA, or the federal government would pay to clean these things up. Extreme burning of man hours and costs associated with the cleanup of these things, and it really it rendered DCI useless for any other purpose, investigatively, because that's all they did was clean up meth labs. So in response to that, laws were passed to restrict the ability of people to get the precursor ingredients that went into making methamphetamine. The primary ingredient was Sudafed, but then there were also chemicals like anhydrous ammonia, lye, and other things that in combination would go into making this stuff. And they started to control how people could get a hold of pseudoephedrine. They started to really lock down these anhydrous ammonia tanks, which was really only available for agricultural purposes. But people would go out into the farmyards and whatnot and steal these big tanks or steal anhydrous ammonia from them and hide it. So as they started to shut that down and make it harder to get the ingredients to make meth, we started to see less and less of the meth labs. So that was pretty effective. And then for whatever reason, methamphetamine just sort of started to disappear in about 2006 and 2007. Maybe a variety of different reasons for that. Some of it could be enforcement. I think that there was a fairly large push from the public to, whether it be media presentation, signs, public awareness, education, things like that may have been effective. Getting the right meth dealers removed from the public, put in prisons, and people just started to shift away from methamphetamine where we didn't see it a lot. I think there was a combination of different efforts that caused that. But in about 2009, it started to come back very significantly. Initially, when it started to come back into our area, it was being trafficked into this area by Asian gang members. That was primarily who we had dealt with in that. And meth had changed. It had gone from a lot of it being made locally to something that was being produced in the southwestern part of the United States and in Mexico. We had some of that before, back in the early 2000s, and there were two different kinds of meth. You can see this yellow one here, and you can see the more crystalline looking one that looks like glass or ice or whatever. And because of that, obviously it was called crystalline ice and whatnot. And the yellow stuff is more the homemade variety. Basically the difference is in the production methods, but essentially the clear stuff or the ice was being made in these super labs. I mean, many of you are familiar with the show Breaking Bad. You know, you see these great big labs where they would make 50 or 100 pounds of the stuff at a time. That's actually pretty accurate in terms of how it's made in these super labs. And then from there it's being trafficked across the United States, much like cocaine would be, or heroin, or other drugs that are manufactured in outside of the country and moved throughout the country. So with the loss of like I said, the backyard anhydrous lab, or whatever you want to call it, this more professionally produced, lab-controlled environment-made meth began to be what everybody wanted. And the positives to that, if there are any, is that it's made in a controlled environment. The ingredients are obviously measured, and you have people with some sort of at least knowledge as to what they're doing and how they're making it, and there's some consistency in the product. The stuff that they're making in the farmyard, who knows who's making it and what's going into it. So, but now, when it started to come back on the scene in like 2009, it was almost entirely this glass or ice or shards or crystal, or however you want to look at it. So even the way we had to deal with it from a law enforcement standpoint was far different. Now we're investigating it more like we would heroin or cocaine cases, not going to the labs all the time, which was good because we stopped burning the resources associated with the labs. The difference is the supply was much higher. There was much more of it around, it was less expensive, and it was more powerful. So it did kind of change that. So we've basically been dealing with it a lot since 2009. It started out fairly small and isolated. We did some good cases back then in 2011 and kind of at least cut into the whole Asian gang member distribution that was going on. But then it started to spread into everybody else, all the other subcultures and races involved in selling it, and changed it quite a bit from that perspective. Some more pictures of you. That's meth from a case back in 2003, and there again, that's more of this kind of homemade meth. See, it's got that yellow color. I've seen it be pink and blue, and it picks up this color from the pills that were made or used to make it at the beginning. When they would crush up Sudafed pills, those pills were red, or they were yellow, or they were blue. The meth would retain some of that coloration from the pills that were originally used to make it. That's why you see the different colors. Just an example of some of the different chemicals that would go into it from the whole anhydrous lab. See, this is called a nurse tank, and essentially the only purpose for that is that farmers inject anhydrous ammonia into the ground. It's a fertilizer for their crops. That's really the only use for anhydrous ammonia. So if anybody had it at their house, there's no reason to have it, and they made it illegal to possess it unless you're a licensed farmer for that purpose. But you can see all the other neat chemicals that go into it. I mean, lye, flammable solvents, organic solvents, just all kinds of fun stuff. Drano, isopropyl alcohol, toluene, iodine. Some signs of the use of methamphetamine, things that you might see in a person: increased heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration, excessive sweating, flushed, tense or anxious appearance, high levels of energy, nervousness, incessant talking, chemical odor on the breath. Like I said, methamphetamine is a stimulant. So, I mean, what it does is it speeds up your heart rate, your respirations. It also speeds up brain function speed. That's why you see rapid weight loss associated with people that use meth, because it is a stimulant, just like a diet pill is a stimulant. It increases your autonomic systems, and that's what burns calories, and that's why meth users lose all their weight. The one thing about meth, and this is something that makes it fairly unique in terms of other drugs and the way people behave when they're on it, is that they don't sleep. They stay awake for days and even weeks on end without sleeping. Like I said, they have an abundance of energy. They don't sleep. So they kind of are in this cycle. Rarely do they have a job or gainful employment. So they're either selling meth or they're committing other crimes to generate revenue to buy more meth to keep using it. So they get themselves in this cycle of use, crime, and it just goes and goes and goes. I mean, imagine a person with a criminal mind with nothing but time on their hands and nothing but energy to go out and think of new ways to commit more crimes. I mean, they're like the perfect criminal in a lot of ways. And that's where we, I think, need to look at them and their behavioral patterns and say, how do we interrupt that cycle? I mean, where do we get into the middle of that, whether it be law enforcement or corrections or prosecution or defense, and try and affect that cycle? Just some other appearance things. The spots and the itching and the open sores, a little bit about that. Because of the chemicals that are associated with making methamphetamine, a lot of them are caustic, a lot of them are, they'll burn your skin if you touch them. Well, like anything that we consume, a lot of it is toxins are released through your skin. And what happens with methamphetamine is that those chemicals that these people are ingesting are taken in or being released from their body. They leave chemical burns. So those are chemical burns as it leaves their body through the pores of their skin. And then it itches and it burns, so they scratch at it, and which creates open sores, and that's where you get this meth bug phenomenon or whatever. There's a lot of hallucination that goes along with meth too. A lot of these folks actually believe that there's bugs under their skin or in their skin or coming out of their skin, so they scratch at it. And of course, the way they're thinking isn't exactly rational. So. We've seen people take screwdrivers to themselves and try and dig the bugs out of their skin and pour gas on it because they think it'll kill the bugs, and all sorts of unique behavior. Just a little bit about the use cycle that you see. People that use it. Some of this is a little dated too. What we would see is people that would use methamphetamine for this 5 to 15 day cycle, and they would stay awake without sleeping a lot of times for all of those days. But then ultimately their body just shuts down on them. They, with lack of sleep, lack of food, lack of everything, they literally pass out, and then they will sleep for as many as 3 or 4 days on end. They won't get up at all, and then they'll wake up and they'll start the cycle over again. Just some old photographs on actual labs that we used to deal with. And these are real photographs from places where we were, the Drug Task Force was. These aren't just out of a magazine, but this is the kind of environment that you would see with people that are making this stuff. And bear in mind, this is a house or a room in somebody's house. This isn't necessarily a shed. And a lot of times there's little kids crawling around and dealing with this stuff too. This is more an example of that big lab that I was talking about too. This, not to bore you with details, but this is a red phosphorus lab, which is a different kind of lab. It's a different actual chemical process for making methamphetamine. Those other ones that we would see locally are called a birch reduction anhydrous lab, just entirely different chemical processes for making meth. This one is more of a professional controlled environment, and it's, like I said, a red phosphorus lab. Very dangerous. These labs produce phosphine gas, which kills people. It's odorless and colorless, and you don't know it's in the atmosphere until you're dead. That's what's dangerous about a red phosphorus lab. But we didn't have them around here very often. They were the anhydrous labs. But the stuff that's being manufactured in Mexico in the southwest is coming from these red phosphorus labs. Things that we would see, the empty boxes of Sudafed pills. Tanks like this that were used to store, carry, transport the anhydrous ammonia that they would take from those big farm agricultural tanks. Just some different paraphernalia associated with it. Light bulbs, people smoke meth out of light bulbs. The reason for that is methamphetamine, to smoke it you have to burn it with a torch. You can't just hit it with a cigarette lighter or anything. That's not hot enough. You need to get it hot enough to vaporize it. So they use light bulbs because the glass in a light bulb is resistant to heat. If you take normal glass or a glass pipe and put meth in it and a torch on it, it would melt. So meth pipes are a little different than marijuana pipes or crack cocaine pipes for that reason. different examples of dump sites and other things associated with meth that you don't probably care that much about. This is worth talking about a little bit, though, these one-pot labs. This is something that we're running across a little bit in the area. They're different than the old full-blown labs that you saw some pictures of there. But what a one-pot lab is essentially they take all the chemicals that they used to use for a larger scale lab that they would run it through individual processes. You know, mix this with that, filter it out, mix that with this, and filter it, and keep going like this. Now with these one-pot labs, what they do is they basically take like a pop bottle or something, and they put everything together in the bottle at once. And usually that's something like cold pills, toluene or some sort of organic solvent, lithium from lithium batteries. They'll peel batteries apart, take little pieces of lithium, put it in there. They will take cold packs. Now they have these like instant cold packs where you break them open and water tablets mixed with basically like it's an ammonia pellet inside of them. Well, they'll peel those open, they'll put those ammonia pellets into this thing. And when they're all done, they shake this thing up and it starts to react. The lithium reacts with the Sudafed, which is being dissolved by the toluene or whatever organic solvents in there. And it starts to basically modify the pseudoephedrine and turn it into methamphetamine. While this is going on, they build pressure. And they become explosive potentially. Lithium is it reacts with moisture. So if you throw lithium into water, it'll explode. It's water, whatever explodes in water. So you got a problem that way. So they burp these bottles and let the pressure off. But if they pass out or forget about it or fall asleep, then they explode. So they're very dangerous. But we do run into these occasionally. And they're made for very small batches of methamphetamine on kind of short notice. Basically, you're a meth user, you run out of meth, you don't know where to get it, you go grab this stuff. You take like 1 or 2 boxes of Sudafed pills and make a very small amount of it at a time, usually somewhere between 1 gram to 3 grams.
Did they show you this on YouTube?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, any of this information is available on the internet. I mean, if you want to know how to make meth, it's pretty easy to figure it out nowadays. And this is just kind of an example of what these things look like. But you'll run across them in ditches along the roadside. People just toss them out the window of their car. Obviously, they don't want to get caught with them. I mean, possessing any of this stuff is a felony. Just some pictures, some scare pictures, I guess, of people. We used to use these back in the early 2000s, and these are actually pictures from billboards. Some of these people are pretty famous nowadays. But just some of the examples of it. But the effects of it are pretty obvious, and they're pretty devastating too. I mean, I think several of you folks have probably dealt with them professionally throughout your careers, but maybe some of you haven't. Hopefully none of you will be dealing with meth labs too often. Maybe some probation and parole folks will be in homes where they might run across these things. So anyway, that's a little bit about what methamphetamine is, kind of the history of it as we've dealt with it, some of the behaviors associated with it. Like I said, our big issue now is how do we interrupt this cycle that these folks are involved in right now? How do we change their behavior, or what can we do? This methamphetamine response committee that Gary has put together, I personally see it as a very valuable tool. It's nice to see the individuals involved in it that are involved in it. This isn't a law enforcement problem. The cops aren't going to fix this. There's no way. We have our responsibility in the criminal justice system, but after that, there are attorneys involved. There's the defense bar, there's prosecution, there's the judiciary, there's DOC, there's human services, there's the health department. I mean, there's all these other individuals that are involved in this, treatment courts. So that group brings all these folks together in one room where we sort of, ask one another, how are we going to do this? What can you do about it? What can you do about it? And from there, start to develop some tactics or strategies to hopefully affect this thing, a little bit more globally. And I think that's been very positive, and we're coming up with some good ideas from it. The one thing with this is, for the folks that, I guess, are the decision makers when it comes down to dealing with this problem, Meth users are very fiendish people. They have to have the drug. They're highly addictive. They have, like I said before, a lot of energy and a lot of time on their hands to think of new and creative ways to commit crimes. I've got another PowerPoint, which is basically just some statistics to show you here. It's sort of, we've been tracking how methamphetamine kind of affects other crime and what else is going on. You can't look at it like you look at other drugs, because other drugs don't do the same things to the folks that methamphetamine does. They don't behave in the same way at all. Everybody likes to talk about heroin these days and how scary heroin is, and it is, because heroin kills people. Meth doesn't typically kill people, or at least not very quickly. It takes a long time. Heroin's popular right now to talk about. The reality is we have very little heroin in our area. Any resources, or all the resources that are being poured into heroin are throwing money at the wrong problem right now in our area. This methamphetamine occupies about 90% of our time at the Drug Task Force. So it keeps us pretty busy. But we've begun tracking how methamphetamine affects, and not just meth, but other drugs are also tied into other crimes that occur. So with the Eau Claire PD particularly, I mean, we as the Drug Task Force work in 6 counties. So, I mean, we have a wider range than just Eau Claire, but we've been tracking this in Eau Claire. So what we're looking at is, okay, when somebody gets arrested for a domestic violence-related crime, or a child abuse-related crime, or retail theft, or some other property crime, what is the involvement of methamphetamine in that, or any other drug for that matter, whether it's marijuana or anything else. So we're starting to see that, you know, what the problem is isn't just the meth user or the meth dealer and the fact that they're selling meth. It's what is meth doing with all these other crimes. How many people are high on meth when they're beating on their wife, or when they're abusing their children, or when they're committing retail thefts? I mean, what is meth actually doing to drive all the rest of the crime that's associated here? And then, of course, you've got all the other price tags associated with it. Health problems that are involved, like I said, property crime, the victimization of other people throughout the community because of methamphetamine. And what you're seeing is there is a large amount of effect that trickles through the community, not just the people that are using it and selling it. This affects everybody else in the community as well. And that's a point that we want to make to the people here. It's not just, it's certainly not a victimless crime. I mean, methamphetamine. This is just a quick chart that shows the increase that's gone on since 2010. Obviously, you can see that it is increasing rapidly to this point in time. I think it's kind of leveling off right now. I don't think we'll see this dramatic increase next year, but it's not going away either. Just amounts of being entered into evidence. This is one of those graphs that kind of points out what I was just talking about, the way that methamphetamine is involved in other cases. Obviously, the big ones where meth shows itself in the cases is the possession and distribution of the drug cases. But then you can see the check welfare, retail theft, probation pickups, bail jumping, mental health cases where, you know, methamphetamine is there. It's involved in these other cases. It's a contributing factor to these other cases. And that's important. And this is something that's fairly new. I guess we've been tracking it for about a year now. But as time goes by, this, I think, is very telling information as far as what the rest of the problem is. It's the UCR reports. This one here, drug-related incidences. This is kind of interesting because marijuana is pretty socially acceptable these days. I mean, if you want to get right down to it. But yet you see methamphetamine cases. You know, we've got a pretty close number of meth cases to marijuana cases in our area. And when you think about that, I mean, how socially acceptable marijuana is, and then to think that you've got almost as many meth cases going on. So that's a bit alarming. Average age charts for people. One thing about meth that is kind of surprising is it doesn't really affect the youth like other drugs do. Kids tend to, mess around with marijuana or maybe even some other the designer drugs like ecstasy or synthetics like bath salts or synthetic cannabinoids, but they're not really messing around with meth, and the ages kind of tend to range from that 20 to 40-year-old mark in there as far as users. Yeah.
I was just thinking back to your other slide. How much crossover is there between people that are involved in meth and then like the opioids or heroin or narcotics or
They're fairly exclusive. I mean, it's a great question. There is one kind of drug use that occurs with meth and heroin. They call it speedballing. It's basically when you're mixing meth and heroin together and you're shooting it with a needle. You get that euphoria from the heroin, but you get the energy from the meth. So heroin is a drug that if you use it, usually heroin users kind of sit on the couch and drool. I mean, they're not very energetic. I mean, heroin is essentially a depressant, a central nervous system depressant, and heroin users are dangerous when they don't have it because of the desperation and needing it and the dope sickness that goes along with it. When they're using it, they're actually pretty docile. But methamphetamine users are kind of the opposite, high energy when they're on it. So
then pot users are pretty much just a pot kind of only,
I would say, yeah, what we see is pretty much any drug user smokes pot, here and there and for whatever reason, sometimes just to relax or settle down. But as far as polydrugging or mixing it with meth, not so much. Meth, just the personality that's associated with a stimulant user versus a depressant user versus a marijuana smoker or a heroin user, they're different kinds of people. I mean, what drives them just from a personality standpoint. Yeah. And I said, I don't think in 22 years of law enforcement, I don't remember ever having to fight with a pot smoker. I mean, fought with plenty of meth users and whatever, but separate argument. So meth, these people are high energy, high speed. I mean, it's just a different kind of personality. I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question. They do cross a little bit. You don't see meth users and cocaine users switching back and forth a lot, though, which is odd because they're both stimulants. But back to this here, the age range. The reason we're not seeing it with the kids is kind of tough to explain, other than maybe kids are a little bit more in tune with what's socially acceptable. I mean, what's popular. I mean, if you're a high school kid, I don't think it's very in vogue to be a meth smoker or shooting meth. So kids care what looks good and what's popular. And I don't think in any level being a meth head is popular or it's going to get you friends in high school. So I think that's the social acceptance or lack of social acceptance with meth. Maybe keeps it away from the kids a little bit. Access, the cost associated with it, maybe fear of needles. Meth is primarily smoked or injected. I guess I didn't mention that earlier, but for whatever reason, we're not dealing with it at a really high level with kids, but they tend to get involved in it pretty quickly after 18 or 20 years old. Just like a density map of meth use or meth-related cases in Eau Claire. This map, pretty much any crime looks like that in Eau Claire. I mean, it centers around downtown and goes out from there. Just some other cases here. Bed days, jail bed days, bookings for meth. You can see the increases over the last few years there. And here again, though, maybe that total of jail bed days, 11% of them are meth related. So, when you put that into the context of all other crime and what methamphetamine is responsible for from a cost standpoint, I mean, that's a bit telling as well. And like I said, a lot of you folks, you deal with these people on a daily basis. It doesn't matter if you're prosecution, defense, or judiciary, or whatever group that you're here with or representing. These folks occupy a significant percentage of your time, and that in and of itself is a problem. Different strategies for dealing with it. We talked about with the Methamphetamine Response Committee. There's individuals in there that are trying to think of ways for prevention. Whether that be billboards out there or social media. We're looking at using Facebook and Twitter and getting out these public service announcements. And there's some pretty compelling video spots that have been put together in other states that we're going to start putting out through Twitter and Facebook for people to see. And, just different ways to try and approach people to get this message into younger people's hands. There's the enforcement standpoint. I mean, that doesn't really change. We as the law enforcement, we try and catch bad guys doing bad things and put them in jail, fairly narrow focus that way. We try and be smart about it. One way that us, as say the Drug Task Force, some of you may be aware of this if you work more closely with us, whether you're prosecution or defense, but I think we try and do a little bit more measured response to drug crime in the area nowadays, and we really try and put our resources into the people that matter. We try and gather a lot of intelligence and spend our time working on the most serious individuals. This helps our prosecutors stay, on top of what they got on their desks, and it allows them to do a better job. Our standpoint from law enforcement, at least in the drug unit, is we can put 100 drug cases on a prosecutor's desk in a week, but a prosecutor can't prosecute 100 cases in a week, so not much happens. So we really try and do our best job on the most important people in the area. Harm reduction. Here again, another group that's really gotten a lot more involved is the DEC program, or the Drug Endangered Children program. We've got officers within the police department and within other departments throughout the area working with DHS very closely to try and look at children in these homes and how this drug is affecting those children. They're testing the children. I don't believe I've heard of an incident where you have a child in a meth user's home that doesn't test positive for methamphetamine. I mean, this stuff directly and immediately affects the children involved in it. And quite honestly, from our standpoint, law enforcement, we see a decline in the sentencing and the response to these drug crimes. Like I said, I've been doing this for 14 years, and I see the ebb and the flow of different drugs and what matters and what's politically popular or a hot topic or whatever. I've seen them transition from one drug to the next, and I've seen sentences rise and fall on things accordingly. Right now, sentences are as low as I've ever seen for drug-related crimes. I remember doing crack cocaine cases on people in 2001 and drug dealers getting 20 and 30-year sentences. That's absolutely unheard of nowadays. Nowadays, if the largest methamphetamine dealer in our area gets 5 years, we're happy. There was a time when those folks were getting, I did a meth case on a guy in 2003, he got 20 years in federal prison. So that's not occurring anymore. So from our perspective, it's like, well, what are we going to do about this? How can we change that? Well, shift it. Look at the children. It's really difficult to turn your back on children that are being exposed to methamphetamine and the negative effects that are happening to it. So now we're going to start going after these individuals, not just for the drug-related crimes, but for the child neglect, the child endangerment, the child abuse that's associated with the drug. And, that does a couple of things. A, it addresses the issue with the children, but B, it also carries more impact for the adults that are involved in this. We feel like we can get more meaningful sentencing on somebody that's convicted of a child abuse-related crime than a drug crime. And then treatment. Another issue where I think DOC is kind of looking at that, ways that they can, in the treatment courts, get these people involved in programs that will hopefully break this cycle, somehow remove them from this continuous use and, go to jail, get out of jail, back to the use and all these things. If somehow there's a break in there, that would be helpful. That's one thing with the modified bond schedule that's been put together by prosecution and defense here that we think is very helpful. Until you can get a person to stop using methamphetamine for a period of time, whether it be 2 weeks to a month, it takes them that long just for their thinking and their thought processes to sort of return close enough to normal that you can actually make any sense to them, that they'll listen to you, or they'll actually start to examine their situation and decide for themselves if they want to make some kind of a change. So if you require them to either sit on a bond or drug test where you can verify that they're actually staying off the drugs long enough, that allows the folks from the treatment courts or DOC or DHS or somebody to get in there and hopefully get them involved in some kind of a program, something to kind of shift their mindset or their behavioral pattern. But this whole, we've had cases where individuals will arrest them. They don't care, okay? They're not afraid of the cops, they're not afraid of prosecutors, and they're not afraid of judges. And the only reason they're afraid of jails is because they can't get drugs in jail, usually. And they're upfront about it. We sit down and talk with every one of these people we arrest, and they're like, you're not going to do anything to me. I don't care. Why would I tell you where I'm getting my drugs from? Because I'm going to be out tomorrow anyway, and I'm going to be smoking meth tomorrow. And they're just that bold and upfront about it. So until, like I said, we can start doing something that changes their mindset a little bit, this will just continue to go on. Here again, some of the folks that are involved in this committee. And and there may be others on here as well, but it's been, we think, fairly successful so far, and hopefully it will just grow in its success and its impact. Just some different protocols that are associated with it, the different approaches being taken under community outreach, the whole social media and getting information out to the public, what the court system is doing about it, and then what's going on, post-conviction, how we're affecting it. So I've got quite a bit of time here for, I guess, questions and whatnot. Kind of ramble on a little bit. Like I said, that's the, yeah.
What's the going rate for meth?
Right now, it's selling for about $100 a gram, give or take. A little bit about meth, I guess some more background here. Just for the folks that, like I said, don't deal with it commonly. Methamphetamine usually sells, a user quantity of meth is about a gram, okay, a paperclip weight or whatever for a day's worth of use. An 8-ball, if you've heard that term, is 3.5 grams. It's an 1/8 ounce. An ounce of methamphetamine is 28 grams. A pound of methamphetamine or anything is 454 grams. We used to see people, an 8-ball of meth was a lot of meth before, even going back just a few years ago. If you saw an 8-ball, it was a lot. You were going to pay $400 to $500 for an 8-ball or 3.5 grams of meth back in the day. We used to pay $100 for a half gram or $200 for a gram 5 years ago. Now a gram of meth is $80, $100. So you see the price drop off on that. The availability, we used to do cases, if somebody was bringing an ounce of methamphetamine from Minneapolis, St. Paul to the Chippewa Valley, they were a big-time meth dealer in our world. Now I can show you 5 different people right now that are bringing multiple pounds of meth to the area every week. So that's the difference. I mean, a really big, what we would call kind of the top-level meth dealer in town here might bring a 1/4 pound of meth around in a week. Now they're doing that every day, and there's several people doing it. And those are the folks that we focus on. We try and identify who those people are. We try and build conspiracy cases on those folks and bring in all of their army of people and try and put the cases together and give them to our prosecutors to prosecute and kind of wipe out a whole group of them at a time. Or take them to federal court as often as we can. We ship them down to Madison too. We just had Amy Wagner get 10 years in federal prison the other day, and Dominic Miller got 8 years, I think, and Chad Manor got 6 years. Those are pretty significant sentences these days. But, sitting down with Amy Wagner and Dominic Miller, well, for one thing, these are folks that we've prosecuted or we've done cases on and put into prison several times in the last 10 years. I know them from, Dominic Miller is a Rusk County product, but he's made his way to Eau Claire a few different times. Amy Wagner is just a bad penny, just constantly a problem. I think that helping these folks is a good thing when you can do it, but the truth of it is that some of them just need to be warehoused. And Amy Wagner and Dominic Miller are 2 of them. They will never change. We've watched them do the same thing for the last 15 years, and there's no reason they would stop. So this is the answer for them. Fortunately, it's not for everybody, but those were good cases. But that's rare that you get 10-year sentences, but these people have been through the system multiple times. But Amy Wagner, she told us in an interview that she has probably brought 20 pounds of methamphetamine to the area in the last year. That's the reality of what she's doing. I mean, what we find out or what we prove is usually just a small fraction of what they've actually done. So a little bit about kind of the change in what's going on in perspective. I guess other questions? Or
They must have a lot of customers if they could bring in that much and get rid of it that fast.
Right. That's something that we do struggle a little bit with, because when they're moving that quantity of it, you would think that everybody on the street would have it in their pocket. And so we kind of look at what patrol gets and the arrests that are made and who has it on them and things like that. And it doesn't, not that we're going to obviously catch everybody with all of that meth on them, but you just think that we would see more of it in the individual user's hands than we're seeing, unless it just, well, I guess a lot of them are just getting away with a lot of it. there are a lot of users in the town too, as far as actual individual users of methamphetamine. And a lot of it, obviously goes outside of the city of Eau Claire, out into the rural areas. A lot of it comes through here and it goes to Ladysmith, the Rusk County, Barron County area. That's a good point to make. Methamphetamine, primarily our source area is Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's really interesting. I just got back from a narcotics officers conference in Green Bay, an annual conference, and we're in there with law enforcement from Milwaukee, Madison, Green Bay, the southeastern part of the state. There's drug cops there that have been doing this stuff for 10 years and they've never seen meth before. Meth, it's a really odd phenomenon. It doesn't really exist on the eastern part of the state, and for them it's just heroin, 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 and that's where you get this statewide outcry because that's where our population centers is, southeastern part of the state. That's where all the government officials are, and that's what their problem is heroin. They experience very little problems with methamphetamine there. It will come to them eventually, and with that population and that problem, they're really going to be in for some trouble when it does. But Chicago has very little meth in it, and if you go east in the United States, you see very little methamphetamine. It's like Eau Claire and west, or Wausau and west. It's really strange. But so our main source area is the Twin Cities, and then as far as the intelligence is concerned, who's ultimately trafficking it across the United States is Mexican organized crime. Moves it from the Southwest or from Mexico and across the United States. When we work cases back to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, ultimately it ends up finishing up in some sort of very organized Hispanic organized crime. I mean, it's pretty interesting. And when it hits that level, it's really hard to investigate because these folks are the real deal. I mean, they will kill each other. They will, Matter of fact, I probably can't talk about it. They had an incredibly large methamphetamine seizure in the western part of Wisconsin here the other day. I mean, far, far larger than I've ever even heard of in my career. When you get something like that, or when somebody screws up, we're talking about millions of dollars worth of dope here. Somebody's going to get killed over it, and those folks will do it. I mean, they're legitimate, scary people over there, and those cases become different. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you see a difference in the external signs? A difference between meth that is cooked in a rural farm laboratory, as you described, versus what is made in the larger, more sophisticated laboratories?
Yes, you do. A lot of those pictures that I had showed you up there, with the scars and all that kind of stuff, those were from the early 2000s. And when they were making more of the meth in these backyard labs, these shed labs, whatever you want to call them. And I think a lot of that was just a lack of consistency in the product. Overusing certain chemicals, whatever. Not chemistry professors doing this stuff. So they're just kind of throwing things together. I think that their health consequences were higher back then. Nowadays, meth is more consistent. I don't think that there's all these excessive chemicals that are used in it that don't need to be there. I'm not saying it's good for you by any means, but we don't see people that look like that as often anymore.
Does that make it any more difficult to identify, the users, or when you come across people?
It might make them harder to identify for just a regular person walking around. Say you've got a family member or a friend or a coworker or somebody that you might suspect is using methamphetamine. I think the biggest thing that you're going to pick up on is the rapid speech, just that constant talking, can't sit still. And some people are just like that. But I think what really signals it, or what you can really pick up on, is the change in behavior. If you know somebody that changes, they are normally, pretty regular person, and all of a sudden they're going 100 miles an hour and they're losing weight and things like that. You won't see them with big meth sores on their face or whatever. You will see track marks or injection marks on them sometimes. Some things like that, but yeah, they're not quite as ghoulish as they, had been 10 years ago. Thank you.
And going back to some of the deck issues, can you talk about versus some of the other drug use, the dangers of what's happening with the residences where this drug is used, and the effects on the people there and on the residence itself, and the amount of work that's involved with making a residence safe to be in after the drug is used or manufactured?
Yeah, that's a great point too. This kind of goes back to that whole collateral damage crime costs associated with however you want to term it. Methamphetamine, here again looking at the DEC program, and what our health departments are starting to do is monitor the residences where these folks are consuming meth. Back in the day, they would examine that if there was a meth lab there. Then they would come in and be testing for chemicals or having to do basically it's like a hazardous material cleanup. But now we're starting to see that just a location where somebody's been consuming methamphetamine, smoking it, it's in the air. If you kind of look at it like if you go into the home of a cigarette smoker, it always smells like cigarettes in there. Well, that's because that smoke has permeated the carpet, the wall coverings, the furniture. Every flat surface in there has residue of cigarette smoke on it. Well, methamphetamine is no different. And we have the health department go in there, and they just swab across any flat surface in that residence. They're going to test it positive for methamphetamine. Well, what are kids doing? They're crawling on the floor, they're grabbing toys, they're doing whatever. These things are all coated with methamphetamine. They're sticking them in their mouth, and that's why these kids will almost invariably test positive for methamphetamine. So now you've got that situation, but these people move. Well, somebody else moves into the house, and now they're contaminating a whole other uninvolved family with methamphetamine. So they have to go in there, and then the whole residence has to be remediated. Carpet removed, walls painted, retested, whatever. So now you're going to have impact on landlords that own these properties. You're going to have impacts on the new tenants from the properties. And that's another thing we're going to start doing is making sure that the health department is actually looking at these things and dealing with it. I just had spoken with a property owner last week about that very issue. We're trying to get a meth dealer evicted from their property or removed from the property because the neighbors are losing their minds because of the drug house in their neighborhood. But I told the property owner, I'm like, when they do leave, you need to go in there and look at this property because it's going to be contaminated. And that, I can't only imagine that price tag would be in the thousands of dollars.
Well, I'm just curious as to whether there have been any studies done on how much effect there is on that level of contamination. I mean, if there are children in a house where methods of use are not made and they do test positive, do you know if that's really a health risk?
And I don't know a lot about that. I mean, I can kind of touch on it a little bit. I know they quantify the level of the tests on the kids from like hair follicle tests. The numbers I'm not too good with, but they can look at how contaminated or how exposed the child has been.
But you don't know if that has any impact on them.
The long-term effects, they're kind of still out there a little bit, as far as what the damage could be to these children in the long term. They can certainly, like I said, tell the level of effect that they are, or at least how much of the drug they've consumed. Some of them, they look at the numbers from a regular methamphetamine user, and then they compare that to the children. We've seen numbers in the children that are as high as a regular user smoker of methamphetamine. So some of these kids are affected to the level of them actually using the drug. As far as health consequences long-term with meth, there's a lot of brain damage associated with it. Kind of getting out on a slippery slope for law enforcement here, but it's a lot like Alzheimer's. They compare the damage that goes on to schizophrenia and Alzheimer's in the brain scans that they do of methamphetamine users. Well, the children are having health problems. They're having breathing problems, high incidences of asthma, irritability, behavioral problems with them. And they find this in, say, the kids where you move into the formerly used meth house. A kid that's not exposed to these drugs, and all of a sudden they're taking their child to the doctor trying to find out what's wrong with my kid. And they're testing them for this, that, and everything else, and allergies and all this stuff, and ultimately they learn that the children are being exposed to methamphetamine, and that's how they find it in the environment, not necessarily that they're using it. So
there have been actual studies that show that?
there's been cases, incidents that have shown that. I don't know about studies. Did you have another question?
Well, it was mainly along the lines of what Sonia said, and I agree that it's a dangerous situation for a child to be exposed, but I'm somewhat troubled when you're talking about trying to ramp up sentences because children may be in the home. And, I'm still playing the defense attorney here, but I think the goal is for us to look at reducing the incidence of people using and to get expensive and weren't really getting at that issue. So I guess I appreciate you're a law enforcement officer and you want to put an end to it, but I think we also have to temper it with the reality